Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. The last few weeks, we've really advanced the colonial cause. Now, behind the scenes, this series is broken down by chapters or seasons in my notes. It's not just for the ease of organizing and locating them later. There's other reasons. So anyway, in the recent past, we spent a good chunk of time in what I called Season 7, working through the internal organization of New England, their consolidation of power after 1638, their internal conflicts, some of which took place in London, like the challenges presented by Samuel Gorton. Most took place within New England, the development of their educational system, missionary work, the economic hardships they faced, the various intermediary systems that they embraced along the way that eventually led to the development of triangular trade. Those first industries proved incapable of sustaining long-term wealth for the general region. They did help to jumpstart some industries like shipbuilding that would eventually be so pivotal. And then in Season 8, just a few episodes, we looked at the emergence of a solid wealth-building and population-sustaining industrial complex. Through men like William Pierce, the idea and vision of triangular trade took off. It not only provided markets for New England goods, it brought currency and relevance to the entire region. The reliance on the natives was greatly diminished, and that would cause relational problems that would come to fruition in a few decades, and we'll get there eventually. In that discussion, we developed the emerging Caribbean plantation system. The trade that grew in a general sense revolved around sugar, rum, and the African slave trade, of which New England became integral. We concluded last week by jumping a little ahead of our current discussion, a little outside the geography, to talk about the Caribbean economy, and more specifically, the challenges the success had created for Barbados. When the island's land was stretched thin because of all the farms, big and small, some of them picked up and moved to Carolina. This proved to be a pretty slick move. This was Spanish territory, but like New England and Jamestown in Virginia, there was a sliver of an opportunity to sneak in, and they took it. The result was the beginning, the origin of the plantation-style economy that would eventually dominate the English colonial South. It almost didn't happen that way. I mean, there was disagreement among the owners, those granted the charter, and the planters or farmers, those that were doing the work. The owners did not want slavery, and they did want freedom of religion. But the tough-minded Barbados farmers demanded slavery, and they proved to be pretty intolerant of non-Anglicans. So we recognize that the success of New England was tied to Barbados and the supply of food to support the slave-based production of sugar and molasses. And as we start a new chapter, we're going to develop the New England region not as a struggling new colonial exercise, as we've been doing, but as a viable economy, a formidable population, and a culture that was very much engaged in the triumphs and the tragedies of the day. Looking ahead at our immediate focus that we're going to start to develop today is the English Civil War, those years. There's actually a few different wars. But we want to look at that through the lens of Charles I. And then we want to look at the interactions with the French in New England. And these are important events on the backdrop of not only English politics, but the raging and shifting wars and allegiances across Europe. We don't want to get too bogged down in these controversies, but enough to understand the whats and the whys of New England policy. These considerations will impact the colonies greatly on several fronts. First was trade. With the Civil War raging, trade was interrupted, and this allowed the colonies to look to other European countries to trade with. I mean, across the Atlantic, it didn't always matter what was going on in Europe. The colonies had their own struggles and economies to worry about. And secondly, their neighbors, especially the French. There was a power struggle in New France that kind of helped New England for a while. Within the next few weeks, we'll develop at least an outline of the French presence. And we'll do a much broader focus in a couple of months when we look at the wilderness wars and the battles fought on the New England frontiers. And then thirdly, because of the trade that emerged, because of the European conflicts. When the English political system kind of stabilized, they reclaimed their prominence and control in the area of trade through the Navigation Acts. And then fourthly, the regicides, which brought the consequences of the Civil War directly to New England. These considerations will take us to the Restoration. That will be a big deal. The entire colonial landscape will change from Charles II through James II and William and Mary, all of which would affect the colonies. They had enjoyed a pretty free ride during the 30s and 40s. Well, maybe they were neglected in the 30s and 40s. Then maybe they were embraced in the 40s and 50s, depending on who was acting the part of in charge, either the Puritans or Charles I. So how do we get there, to those 4 points that we want to begin to develop? We get there by understanding what was happening back home in England. So for the next couple of weeks, 2 or 3 maybe, I want to travel back across the Atlantic and spend some time focusing on the kingship of Charles I. A lot of what we're going to talk about will have been shaped by the events in Europe, and more importantly, the court of Charles I. The events of his monarchy, during and after, played a substantial role in the lives of the colonies. What we'll really be developing is the English Civil War, or wars, but I want to work through those years quickly through the lens of Charles, or his actions. There was a lot going on, so we'll really only scratch the surface. What I want to do is develop 3 primary aspects then. First, a short bio of Charles and his wife. Second, how the king dealt with Parliament. And third, the Civil War years, or more clearly, the years of the Civil Wars. There were a few. During these years and conflicts, there was a lot of tension between the 3 kingdoms, Ireland, Scotland, and England. These tensions were not all or only political. As with most conflict in Europe during those years, religion played a huge role. All 3 kingdoms would experience violence. We won't spend too much time developing these events. Like I said, our goal is to understand how these events affected colonial New England. So just keep in mind the proportion of what we're talking about. The numbers are hard to substantiate exactly, but historians think that about 180,000 people died from fighting, accidents, and disease. That was about 3.6% of the population. If we want to put some perspective behind that, by comparison, during World War I, around 2.6% of the population had died. So the civil wars in England were pretty disruptive, to say the least. So as we work through this material, I'll leave it to you to decide if Charles was a classically tragic figure, if he was heroic, villainous, treasonous, a tone-deaf autocrat whose own stubborn disposition led not only to his own downfall, but the empowerment of Parliament over the monarchy. Either way, he's a fascinating study, complicated and multifaceted, just like the times that he lived in. So Charles I was born on November 9th, 1600, to King James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth, the last of the Tudor line, died. Succeeding her, James was the first of the Stuart line. Charles was a sickly boy. When James became the King of England, and then known as James I, Charles was left in Scotland for a time because of his weakness. In fact, when Charles was 5, he was still being carried around in the arms of other people. So James was the first monarch to reign over the 3 kingdoms of Ireland, Scotland, and England. And we'll put Wales in there too, England, Wales. He started out great, but the positive mood that had ushered him into power soured. In 1605, there was the Gunpowder Plot, a Catholic orchestrated plot to blow up the Parliament and the king. So religious tension was on the rise in England, and that will play a role in the life of Charles on a host of levels. This is the king for whom we honor when we talk about the King James Bible. I'm talking about King James I, not Charles. Anyway, back to our person of interest, Charles. He was small in stature and had a slight speech impediment. He loved his siblings and was lonely when his brother Henry died in 1612. And in yet another reminder of the slight-framed Charles, the golden suit of parade armor Henry had left behind when he died was too big for Charles. His sister Elizabeth left England in 1613 when she married Frederick V, Elector of the Rhine-Palatinate. This was a marriage into Protestant royalty, the first part of James's plan. He wanted to play mediator or the middleman between the Scotch-Dutch German Protestants and the French-Spanish Catholics. Now, keep this in the back of your mind because we're going to revisit this just a little bit in a few minutes. So all he needed was a Catholic link to secure in his mind a measure of security and leverage against the powers of Europe. In 1623, young Charles made a not-so-secret trip to Spain to secure a marriage with King Philip III's daughter. That would have been the Catholic link that James was looking for. And Charles was escorted by the Duke of Buckingham. He was one of James's favorites, and he would also be one of Charles's. Well, the trip didn't go very well. The Spanish demanded that Charles give favor to Catholicism. I mean, frankly, Charles and the Duke of Buckingham made fools of themselves. But we'll stay close to the needed narrative here, so without getting into too much of the silliness. James really wanted this marriage, and the Spanish knew it. They made all sorts of embarrassing concessions that Charles was willing to accept, but they went one step too far. The marriage was going to be conditional. It was going to be on paper only when they were actually married. It wasn't going to be consummated for a year. And during that year, Charles would remain in Madrid. I mean, frankly, all of James' government would be under the thumb of Spain. If, after the year was over, so the deal said, and things had gone well in the Spanish eyes, then Charles could return to England. If things didn't go so well, too bad, the marriage was off. To make matters worse, over there in Frederick's Rhine Palatinate, the Spanish had caused some real trouble in 1620, to the point that Frederick and Elizabeth, Charles's sister, would eventually end up in The Hague, where they would set up an exiled court. So that would be kind of interesting, marrying into the Spanish family, knowing that they had exiled the other half of your family. Anyways, Charles refused. He and Buckingham returned to England and convinced James that a war with Spain was in order. So, just about 20 years removed from the last war with Spain, which had run from 1585 to 1604, that war that had included the Spanish and the English armadas, both national disasters, that war that had prevented England from launching their colonial empire for an additional 20 years due to the smothering debt that they had incurred. Well, they were at it again. Anyway, in the meantime, a Catholic marriage was arranged with Henrietta Maria of France. And Henrietta Maria would play a big role in Charles's downfall later on. But for now, I just want to highlight her lineage. We spoke a lot about her family tree way back in episode 3. Henrietta Maria was the daughter of Henry IV and Maria de' Medici. And if you remember, Henry IV had been known as Henry Navarre. He was a professing Catholic as king, but had been at one time an up-and-coming Protestant. In fact, the marriage of Henry and Marie, if you recall, had sparked the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre in 1572, which saw the slaughter of many of France's most prominent Protestants, including Gaspard de Coligny. It was an ugly affair. It was a part of a series of civil wars remembered as the Wars of Religion, which raged in France from 1562 to 1598 and concluded with the Treaty of Nantes, where France was officially Catholic. But some concessions had been made for the Protestants. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre was loaded with intrigue. If you remember from that episode, and it's worth going back if you haven't listened to it, many people believe that the whole thing was orchestrated by Catherine de' Medici, Henrietta's mother. So here's a connection to some real dysfunction. Anyway, the marriage would not start out so good. I mean, Henry had been in prison for like 4 years. Anyways, the problem that Charles was going to have was that Henrietta was a staunch Catholic. The French proved to be almost as slippery as the Spanish. Maybe it was just the naivete of Charles and company, but one of the agreements for the wedding was that English troops and ships would aid the French in an attack on Spain. However, what actually happened was that the English aid was used to attack the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle. Ouch. So all in all, Charles is not exactly setting the world on fire here. It's not just the double cross, not just that they failed to strike a blow against the hated Spanish. It's not just the frustration or embarrassment, but Charles was a devoted Protestant, Anglican. He had much more in common with the French Huguenots than the Catholics. And we need to make that distinction. He was Protestant, Anglican, because the root of Charles's problems, it could be argued, was the hatred and fear that existed between Protestants and Catholics. especially the more right wing of Protestantism, the Puritans, which we spent a lot of time talking about. So to top that off, there was a lot of tension between the Puritans and Charles. But also in time, Charles would manage to really tick off the Presbyterians in Scotland. For simplicity's sake, the Puritans were very conservative and demanded autonomy within the church. The Presbyterians shared a lot of the same doctrines, but were more organized. Anyway, let's not get too far ahead. Are you still with me? I mean, trust me, this is all going to come together pretty nicely. So in 1625, James I died, and it was March, and Charles ascended the throne. And he married Henrietta Maria in June. So he became the second monarch to oversee the three kingdoms. He was not what you'd imagine for an English king. He had a Scottish accent, he had slight speech impediment, stammer, he was small in stature, he was shy. I mean, no wonder why. But he was also said to be courteous, good-tempered, and not prone to vices. He loved and supported the arts. He did not mingle with others, and he kept his distance from the folks. That combined description draws quite a picture in my head of who he was. Coupled with the paintings that I've seen, I almost feel like I could be comfortable with him if I met him. I could almost pity or sympathize. I could understand his waywardness, his distance, if not for title's sake, then for social discomfort. But those descriptions really only work if you afford some artistic license to go with them. Though they're true, he was an isolated man with few close advisors. And frankly, he was a relic of yesterday. Charles was pleasant, he was refined, and he did support the arts. But his self-control and good manners, his recognition of very few close advisors, his distance and isolation from the people was more than piety, although he was pious, more than humility or shyness. Charles was a relic. And in that, he viewed his kingship as a direct assignment from God. That meant he was answerable to no man, answerable to no church. He was the state. He was the head of the church. Everybody, including Parliament, served at his pleasure. I'm not being critical, but measure the idea of good-natured or pious or isolated or any other description, not with the modern mind that truly can't perceive this mindset, but rather with the contemporary mind of his day. Remember, England was changing. It was not just a religious change. It was not the century-old religious contention. It was the idea, through increased trade, of the world getting smaller. The European world, to include England, becoming more cosmopolitan, more liberal. The entertainment was more crass. There was cross-dressing. And the social conservatives, most notably the Puritans, were aghast. Parliament, though still called by the monarch and subservient, was growing in power, or wanted to. I mean, even Elizabeth had been forced at times to make concessions to Parliament. Charles didn't recognize any responsibility to do that. He was an autocrat. He answered to God alone. So maybe he had good intentions. Maybe he really cared. But those attitudes were only visible through the veil of a mindset that understood and lived by absolute rule. He was tough to get along with. And add to that, the economy was changing. Mercantilism was on the rise. Feudalism had failed. Money was being made in unprecedented ways by a lot of people. Those people were being elected to Parliament. They were businessmen, and their policies in that changing economy with the advent of colonialism reflected a national interest, as well as personal interest. A lot of these guys were Puritans, and their numbers were growing. Charles was an Anglican, whom the Puritans did not like. He wasn't Protestant enough for them. They wanted ecclesiastical autonomy, while Charles liked the organization of Anglicanism. And he was married to a French Catholic, who the Puritans feared, who also did not hide her disgust with all things Protestant. To her credit, if you really believed that Protestantism was a sure way to hell, she had a predictable attitude. At any rate, things being as they were at that point in history, how do you think that played itself out? I mean, remember, the 30 Years' War was heating up. They were 2/3 of the way through the 80 Years' War, all centered around religion. The political showdown to come was very predictable, but it would not truly show itself until the social and religious chasms became too great to ignore or to mend. The failed mission to Spain was perhaps a foretaste of things to come. The disaster had been diplomatic, and so would all of Charles's failed relationships be. England, Ireland, Scotland. Again, I find it ironic that Charles was recognized as pious and good-natured, without vice. It really does depend on who you read and your personal flavor of leadership and religious freedom. I mean, maybe he was, but then all the world was wrong. From a social aspect, if you can believe it, it was worse. Charles liked the arts. He supported them. In that realm of artistic and aristocratic airs, he threw big, big parties. Big, expensive parties. Anybody who was anybody wanted to be on that invite list. These parties entertained all of the aristocracy and then some. They were called masques or masquerades, and they were these elaborate one-night parties, basically to celebrate and pump up the king. I want to develop the atmosphere around the masque before we tackle the politics of the day. Those troubles began right away and would continue to escalate. But as we look at the parties, the masques, plays performed over the years, imagine how these detestable gatherings would help to augment and stoke the political and religious tensions. As an institution, the masque predated Charles by decades. These were very elaborate parties where the guests would dress up and participate in theater-style productions. I mean, top of the line. They were held at both Whitehall and Hampton Court palaces. They included singing and dancing, special effects, moving scenery, the works. They were allegorical and fantastic stories of mythology and history. They underscored the autocratic, divinely inspired rule of the king. So again, there's a political purpose behind these parties. There was lively dancing, even the queen. The room would be overcrowded and hot. Picture this scene, smoky and loud. Sometimes the women would wear low-cut dresses or tops, and they would bare their breasts, just kind of walk around with their boobs hanging out. There was a lot of drinking, and sometimes puking, even during the theater productions. Even foreign diplomats would be in attendance, and there were fights, even among them. Everybody wanted to be seated as close to the king as possible. It even was a tradition to lay waste to the refreshment table at the close of the play, so just make a complete mess. Anne of Denmark, James I's wife, the guy who commissioned the King James Bible, once performed in blackface to a seaside decorated set, in a pretty skimpy outfit, by the way. Not very politically correct for our day, certainly. And Charles and Henrietta Maria continued that tradition. Charles had performed in 1622 as Prince Charles, and then another round of plague hit, and the masque was suspended for a number of years. But Charles would return again in 1631, and this time as the king. Henrietta and her entourage enjoyed participating many times. And when we say elaborate, and then we start to verbalize it, I want you to understand when you're thinking about, what we're talking about was going on, the crowds and the room and the heat and the smoke and the food and the plays and the drinking and just you name it. These parties were performed twice a year for a long time, to the tune of, it's estimated, $500,000 apiece. One night, $500,000 in 1630s money. That's a lot of cash. Imagine the scandal of these parties then. I know they still go on today somewhat, I'm guessing. But imagine if our leaders openly partied like this. Now let's think about the growing Puritan power base at this time. A power base that included commerce and military and government, a power base that is quickly becoming Parliament. Now, we talked about English society in these days in episode 14, so we're just going to look at this through the lens of 17th century Puritanism. To begin with, and painting with a very broad brush, I understand, the Puritans felt that secular entertainment kept people from worshiping God. They believed that the popularity of the theater was representative of societal sin. Obviously not all theater, but the popular stuff. The Puritans believed that the ideal person was one who separated himself from the world, resisted its evil influence, and spent their energy on the work at hand. They disapproved of dancing, feeling that led to pride and vanity. So these were the guys young Charles would have to work with, or deal with, or live with, or not, for the rest of his life. Remember, an awful lot of Puritan colonization was to separate and to make money. To many, Charles's court was anathema, so you left. Or you stayed and you challenged it. From the beginning, Charles would be challenged. The first parliament he presided over was in June of 1625. His advisor, the Duke of Buckingham, yeah, the same Duke of Buckingham that served James and accompanied Charles to Spain, the same Duke of Buckingham that wasn't popular, the same Duke of Buckingham that was seen as a threat. Well, Charles held him in high esteem. As a matter of fact, Buckingham was the cause of a shaky start to the royal marriage. That would change upon his death. But anyway, that's later in our storyline. Charles had the Duke of Buckingham as his main advisor. And there were a few things that had happened pretty quickly that set the stage for years to come. I mean, Charles was not totally innocent here. The first thing, outside of the Duke of Buckingham being a pain in everybody's butt and Charles already taking part in the masques, the first thing that he did was to pick Richard Montague to be the court chaplain. Now, again, we've talked about the religious strife here, even amongst the Protestants, Presbyterians, Puritans, the Anglicans. Well, Montague was something altogether different. He was a Protestant, but he was an Arminian, meaning that he had opposing views on justification, especially to the Puritans, who were Calvinists. He believed in free will, and the Calvinists believed in election, if we want to cut right to the chase. This was a controversy that had already brought literally civil war to the Netherlands in 1618. He might as well have been Catholic. I mean, the Puritans considered this heresy. Charles thought that his presence might expand the Church of England. I'm not sure if this was arrogance or hubris or stupidity or just plain tone deafness to the spirit of the day, but it was a bad pick. It was a divisive pick. Parliament was willing to play the game, however. Religious considerations would become part of the financial conversation. You want money? Let's talk about ecclesiastics. Montague would be investigated. Actually, Buckingham would also make that list. His advice had not proven very sound. He was never really popular. And he'd been around a long time. I mean, the guy had a track record. So at that time, the war with Spain was not going very well. The war that Charles had initiated. He gave no explanation to Parliament about that or his foreign policy in general. Remember, he didn't believe he owed anybody any explanation for anything. Parliament was already showing signs of deep discord and division. You had the Puritans who pressed for extemporaneous prayer and preaching in the Church of England, and the Anglicans had their faction as well. They came to be known as the High Church Party. They advocated for the prayer book and established ritual. Now keep this in mind. These same arguments would arise again in Scotland, which we'll get to. Right now, we want to lay the foundation of problems that Charles had in England. It's important to realize as we begin to divide Parliament that in those days, the idea of a political party was almost unheard of. Charles had galvanized English politics. Because of this friction, Parliament struck the first blow. They refused to grant Charles the right to level certain taxes unless it increased Parliament's power. How do you think that sat? First, Charles believed his monarchy was a divine appointment. I mean, who are these guys to tell him anything? Clowns? This was a right usually granted to monarchs for life, so it was pretty standard stuff that they were refusing him. On the second Parliament, in February of 1626, things escalated. First, Charles had read the tea leaves. Between the first and second Parliament he presided over, he had appointed many former leaders that were opposed to him in the House of Commons as sheriff in their counties, and that he supposed would keep them away. But opposition persisted. The previous fall, in 1625, as part of that war on Spain, the Duke of Buckingham had botched an attack on Cadiz. The rumor was that he had not really been that engaged. The House of Commons tried to impeach the Duke of Buckingham for treason. Remember, Charles did not feel he had to answer to anyone, but did rely on the Duke of Buckingham for advice. So how do you think that went over? To try to get out of trouble, the Duke of Buckingham suggested to go to war with France on the side of the Huguenots. I mean, why not? Spain wasn't going very well, but you could always rally the troops to the cause against another Catholic nation, especially if you're helping Protestants. And here's a spoiler alert. This campaign would be about as successful as the Spanish campaign was. It would not end well for Buckingham, but he did live to fight another day. Anyway, Parliament threatened to withhold funds unless Buckingham was impeached. I mean, are you sensing a general antagonism and an animosity here? Are you seeing a pattern emerging? Because Parliament did. It didn't matter. The domestic diplomacy had already failed. Charles dissolved Parliament in June. Now, there was a real need for money. So Charles forced a loan, which was declared illegal. I mean, there's the law, and then there's the privilege of an autocratic ruler. Which would it be? So again, already, so early in his reign, Charles appeared tone deaf. He dismissed the Chief Justice and he ordered the arrest of more than 70 knights who refused to pay the tax. Guess what dominated the conversation at the Third Parliament under Charles? I mean, from a distance, we can all see the erosion of diplomacy and tact here, can't we? In March of 1628, when Parliament convened, Charles was challenged by a petition of rights, which had been supported by some of our old friends, the Earl of Warwick and Viscount Say and Seal. Remember the guys that had funded Saybrook and some of the Caribbean colonies? Also, there had been an about-face, and England, by Buckingham's charge, had made an attempt to aid the French Huguenots at La Rochelle. Now, there had been some financial shenanigans here as well, and it failed in stupid ways. I mean, the king looked foolish. Think about that in terms of what Charles went home to as well. Henrietta hated Protestantism. Charles had to be miserable at this time. Parliament had challenged him. Buckingham messed everything up. Henrietta didn't like Parliament or Buckingham. Life must have sucked. I mean, I picture Charles talking to God, just looking up at the sky, throwing his hands in the air and saying, "Why me?" Well, Parliament began to act within the boundaries with which they were given. They passed resolutions that condemned, quote, arbitrary taxes and imprisonment, end quote. That was a direct response to Charles's actions. And then they wanted 4 basic principles to be recognized. 1, no taxation without Parliament's approval. 2, no imprisonment without cause. 3, no quartering of soldiers. And 4, no martial law in times of peace. You can already guess what else had been going on. Some of the same themes would be elevated 150 years later across the Atlantic. Anyway, Parliament demanded the king's agreement. One problem would soon be eliminated. The Duke of Buckingham would be assassinated on August 23, 1628. The next Parliament, in January of 1629, things got worse. Well, things went as badly as they could have. The House of Commons was in no mood for any crap. They were looking to establish their authority. With Buckingham gone, maybe they thought they'd get somewhere with Charles. The House now objected to the reinstatement of popish practices, what they considered popish practices in the churches, as well as the levying of certain taxes without their consent. It was at this point that you could say things got real, because Charles dismissed Parliament. And they didn't leave until the Speaker was physically held in his chair and 3 resolutions were passed condemning Charles's actions. And I want to read this from Simon Schama's book, A History of Britain, Volume 2, The Wars of the British, 1603 to 1776. Schama wrote this, quote, Charles had ordered a suspension of parliamentary proceedings to allow discussions to proceed without further public polarization. The order, of course, was construed as an enforced shutdown, and the militants in the House of Commons loudly advertised it as an infringement of their rights to debate. On the 2nd of March, 1629, the Speaker, Sir John Finch, attempted to adjourn proceedings in compliance with the King's order, but was told that he was the Commons' servant, not the King's, and would not be allowed to suspend debates until a resolution attacking and condemning, quote, innovations in religion, end quote, and extra parliamentary taxes had been read. In an awkward bind, Speaker Finch replied, rather pathetically, I am not the less the king's servant for being yours. I will not say I will not put it to the question, but I must say I dare not. He had no choice. Sir Miles Hobart had locked the door of the house and kept the key, with the king's officer hammering on the door and Denzil Hollis, the member of Godly Dorchester, and a big man, pushing the speaker down in his chair and making sure he stayed there. The most eloquent leader of the radicals, Sir John Eliot, held the floor, warning that, quote, none had gone about to break parliaments, but in the end, parliaments had broken them, end quote. Resolutions of startling fierceness were then read, declaring, quote, whoever should bring innovation of religion, advise the taking and levying of subsidies not granted by Parliament, to be a capital enemy of the kingdom and commonwealth, and every subject voluntarily complying with legal extractions, a betrayer of the liberties of England and an enemy to the same, end quote. Shouts of acclamation, "Aye, aye, aye," rang through the battle-hot House. 2 days later, Hobart, Hollis, Eliot, and 6 others were arrested and sent to the Tower. Parliament dissolved on the 10th of March. End quote. And for the next 11 years, Charles would reign without calling a parliament. That's a bit of a mess, a bit of a temper tantrum. It's like he said, "I'll show you. You want to challenge me? You want to embarrass me? I won't acknowledge you exist. You don't exist." In the short term, peace was made with France and Spain. I mean, he had to. Those wars weren't going very well. Taxes would be levied, but those would be challenged. Still, Charles would rule without a lot of direct contact with his subjects for over a decade. And as he ruled, his enemies, who might have been allies, stewed at being marginalized. And the whole time, all parties must have realized that there would come a time when Charles would be forced to call a parliament, and there would be a price to be paid. And that's what happens oftentimes when you marginalize a party. You will need them again, and they may not be so gracious when you do. So, what side would you have fallen on? The divine right of absolute rule, or a system of checks and balances? I think in the grand scheme of things, the trouble brewing here in England can be distilled down to that question. And if so, who was the villain and who was the hero? Who's the classic tragic figure in this storyline? Well, as you might have guessed, there would come a time of need. And when Charles recalled Parliament, all those years later, things would not simply pick up where they left off. They would escalate beyond anyone's wildest imagination. But those are stories for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.